Okay. All right. So I think what we're going to do, we're going to try and break this down into various component parts. But before we do that, Vince, could you just, because I know there's a lot of very experienced researchers here, but this stuff does get uploaded to the YouTube channel. So would you mind just spending a few minutes, please, if you can, on your background and how you got into all of this, and what it was like actually, tracking down these Secret Service agents in the old days, pre-internet, and so forth, so that the world can understand, what you actually went through to achieve what you did.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all. Yeah, my name is Vince Palomera from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, United States. And I'm 58 now, and I began this journey basically when I was 12 years old, 1978. At the same time, 1978, as we all know, the Haas Select Committee on Assassinations, the second major U.S. government investigation of the assassination, was going on. So as a 12-year-old preteen, I was fascinated by the news reports at night about the assassination. At the same time, my mom and dad were big fans of President Kennedy, and they were also very much stricken by his assassination. So it was kind of like a two-part thing. They'd regale me about stories about his life and also about that tragic day. So you think that's it. But while all that was going on, there was maybe an incongruous event that was happening, but it was something that definitely was a touchstone for my research. There was a fictional television show about the Secret Service of the 19th century called The Wild Wild West, and again, focused on the Secret Service. So when I started to look into the Secret Service or the assassination of JFK, I started to focus on the agents. I was fascinated by all the men in suits around President Kennedy and the various newsreels and whatnot. I started to notice some things and wonder why agents weren't around a car, this, that, and the other. But I would say it was not till like 1988, the late 80s to the very early 90s, I began serious primary research. And it all began, I'll keep this brief, in 1991 at a conference in Fredonia, New York, with fourth decade fame. He had a little conference there, and some of these gentlemen were old enough to be my father or grandfather, authors, and they were fascinated by my take on the Secret Service. It was largely through secondary sources and this, that, and the other. And they were like, Vince, I'll be honest, I never really thought about the Secret Service. That's why they call the Secret Service secret. It was something I never really thought of. Everybody focused on the mafia, the CIA, the FBI, and other things, but the Secret Service has largely been, especially at that time, ignored or glossed over. Well, it definitely inspired me to start to do primary research, contacting these gentlemen. And keep in mind, this is largely before the internet. I mean, there were some computer bulletin boards, but for all intents and purposes, the average person in the street didn't know what the internet was, and I certainly didn't at that time. So just through telephone directory and correspondence and newspaper archive research to try to find these gentlemen, I ended up contacting over 70 former Secret Service agents, the vast majority from the Kennedy era, and this is years before Gerald Blaine and Clint Hill wrote their books. That's another story itself. And they started to tell me things that went against official history. That's basically when people say, like, Vince, like I've written 6 books. I got one coming out next month. First book, Survivor's Guilt, took 20 years to research and write, and it encompasses a lot of my early research. And one after another, they were telling me things that went against, again, official history. The one thing I will say, September 27th, 1992 is a date will live in infamy with me. I spoke to the head of the White House detail, Gerald Bain, B-E-H-N. He was the #1 agent for Kennedy. And I asked him, just matter-of-factly, about agents being ordered off the back of the car by President Kennedy. And he cut me off and says, I don't remember Kennedy ever saying anything about not having agents on the back of the car. If you look at the newsreels, you'll see agents on there. And I was flabbergasted and just couldn't believe I was just struck by what he had to say. But then after a couple of days, I started to calm down and say, well, he was very lucid, but somebody could say that's one man, although he was the #1 agent. Well, what began my earnest was when I started to contact these gentlemen from all across the country, they were corroborating what Mr. Bain had to say and a whole lot more. And so through the years, basically really from 1990 on, but 1992 was the big year. Again, I just started to find these guys through directory assistance and corresponding. So in writing in on the phone, find a lot of these gentlemen. And again, they went against official history. Now, incongruously, sometimes they would say Oswald acted alone. There's nothing to this. But they would tell me things security-wise that went against official history. And, the big thing has always been with me is, Oswald or no Oswald, conspiracy or no conspiracy. If the Secret Service would have done their normal professional job, yes, up to that time, not looking at it afterwards, Kennedy would have lived. So that's been the big impetus through all the books and things like that. So that leads us up to the present day. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Vince. So look, just so that we know what's coming, we're going to break this down into Secret Service activities and events pre-assassination. We're going to take a look at the performance in Dallas, Fort Worth, and we're going to have a look at the post-assassination activities as well. Vince, you're on record multiple times for having 3 bad actors in this. We're going to talk about Vince's bad actors and perhaps any other persons of interest he thinks may have come along during his journey. And then we might, if we have time, we'll look at Vince's thoughts on the attempt on Trump to see if we come full circle. So if we could start, Vince, with the, again, because there's some people out there that won't know as much as this room. Can you give us some insight into the background of the Secret Service agents in that era of 1963? Where are they coming from?
A lot of these gentlemen were from former military backgrounds in the United States, as well as police organizations. It seems like that's what the recruiting field was. A lot of them from Michigan State University, MSU. So a lot of them had law backgrounds, again, and some of them had intelligence backgrounds. The OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA, Deputy Chief of the Secret Service, Paul Paterny, again, was an OSS man. He worked with James Angleton and Raymond Roca of the CIA back in the OSS days, and he's one of the primary people that inspected the presidential limousine afterwards. But that's the story we'll get to in a second. But yeah, basically they came from, local police organizations and military and whatnot. So, because they were always looking for clean-cut gentlemen, background checks and whatnot. And and a lot of them seem to be from the D.C., Maryland area, like the tri-state area around Washington, D.C., but not exclusive.
But it's interesting that you mentioned CIA and OSS in that response.
Yes, yeah, with Paul Paterny. Again, he was the deputy chief. He was the man right below Chief Raleigh, and he was the one that did a lot of activity right after the assassination. He closed the United States border. He worked with Inspector Thomas Kelly. As we know, Thomas Kelly interviewed Lee Harvey Oswald after the assassination. He was involved in some check writing investigations when it came to Oswald and in other matters. And again, the big thing was finding the bullet fragments and skull particles in the limousine. He was there. So it's interesting, a connection with, James Angleton and Ray Roca, the CIA. They worked hand in glove during World War II in the OSS. And the same gentleman literally has his hands in the limousine that night. So if anybody thinks there's any chicanery going on, it definitely leads one towards suspicion. He was also, interestingly enough, he was the special agent in charge of the Chicago office in the 1950s. Who was a special agent in charge of the FBI in the 50s? Guy Bannister. So I'm sure they knew each other. The FBI and the Secret Service works hand in glove in a lot of federal matters, especially threats to the president and whatnot. But I could just, if you want to, Neil, I can go into like prior motorcades. I could say, tell you what.
That was going to be one of my next questions. But just prior to that, could you also
Sure.
give us an insight into the culture of the Secret Service? I mean, if you've read or heard what Avery and Bolden has said, it seems that there was quite a significant drinking culture and racism as well. Could you comment on that?
Yes. Abraham Bolden came out with his book, but he was saying it for years. Echo from Dealey Plaza. I spoke to Abraham many times, corresponding with him as well. He's also a Facebook friend too. 89 years old, still doing pretty well, all things considered. And the reason why he quit the White House detail after only a month, it was a 30-day trial period, and he decided, no, I'm going back to the Chicago field office because he was a victim of racism. It was an agent, Harvey Henderson, who was from the Deep South. And at first, some people being skeptical said, we just have Abraham Bolden's word for this. But then other agents I interviewed conceded, yeah, Harvey Henderson was from Mississippi. He talked Mississippi. He was definitely racist. There's no doubt about it. And some documents that came out in the late 1990s, early millennium, thanks to the Assassination Records Review Board, confirms that Harvey Henderson was his temporary shift leader, because there were some people from the Secret Service who were trying to squelch out, like Gerald Blaine of the Kennedy Detail book fame. He tried to say that Harvey Henderson wasn't even on his shift. And lo and behold, documents came out that confirmed that Harvey Henderson was the leader of his shift. But Harvey Henderson and other agents from the South were angered at President Kennedy's view on civil rights. They didn't like a Negro agent, as they called Abraham Bolden. They also said some other words I can't repeat, the N-word and whatnot, and made Abraham's time on the detail a living hell. On one hand, President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were very gracious to Abraham Bolden's, telling him he's the Jackie Robinson, the first African-American agent of the Secret Service, wore that badge of pride, and yet his own fellow comrades, after hours and whatnot, were putting him down, were getting him involved in any activities and whatnot, really making him feel ostracized. So he carried that bad taste to his mouth back to Chicago office, but it turns out Maurice Martineau, a former White House detail agent, was his boss there, and he exhibited racism, and he also exhibited disturbing feelings about President Kennedy. There was a feeling in the Secret Service that a lot of them were conservative, a lot of them were Republican, as they are today, in fact. Not to digress, but just very briefly, I'm sure you're aware of the January 6, 2021 insurrection, and it turned out a lot of the Secret Service agents were very pro-Trump and anti-Biden when they're supposed to be apolitical. But these men are human, they have their own feelings. Well, back to Kennedy's time, a lot of them were, pro-Eisenhower, again, conservative, and they were aghast. I mean, I'm a big fan of President Kennedy, but begrudgingly, the one area that's concerning is he definitely had a kind of a scurrilous private life. Some of it's been exaggerated, but still it's there. And these agents were married, working on low pay. Not all of them. There's a lot of them that admired President Kennedy. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on the Secret Service as a whole. Most of these men and women were honorable then as now, but there was a few bad apples. That's all it takes. But again, there was an undercurrent of hostility towards President Kennedy, again, for his view on civil rights, his view on Vietnam, his view on Cuba, especially. People always talk about Vietnam, but really from 61 to early 63, Cuba was really a hot button. A lot of them wanted to see Curtis LeMay bomb Cuba back to the Stone Age. So he had that kind of feeling, and they were not too thrilled about President Kennedy not wanting to invade Cuba and giving his pledge. And, we had the FBI begrudgingly, closing down the camps and whatnot. So this was the mindset, military, conservative. Again, they didn't like what they were seeing on the road, protecting this man, President Kennedy. And, I hate to say it, but there was times that he had ladies on the road, so to speak, and things like that. And when these men are married with kids, divorce was a scarlet letter back then, so was adultery. It's a little more open-minded, unfortunately, today, but back in the late 50s, early 60s, that was a different time. And so you had that kind of all working, in the minds. And I always tell people that it's not that a few Secret Service agents pulled any triggers. All it takes is a few seconds to stand down and allow those triggers to be fired, so to speak. So he had that kind of background as President Kennedy, went through motorcades, whatnot, 61 to 63. Now, the thing is, a lot of people have a natural tendency to think the Secret Service, well, a lot of that stuff, Vince, was only because of the assassination they started to guard building rooftops and have heavier security. But I found it actually from FDR, Eisenhower, and the Kennedy era, multi-story building rooftops were normally guarded and other security measures were normally invoked. And as I told Neil last week, it's an amazing thing. It's only been the last 5 to 15 years that a lot of films and photos have been discovered, remastered, have been released due to the deaths of the primary photographers, being put in public domain, like a vast majority of the JFK Library's holdings. Cecil Stoughton and Robert Knudsen, the two major White House photographers who passed away, they donated everything free of charge. You can, get them online. But the point is that for many years, all we had was the inaugural motorcade in Dallas, and very little in between. If anybody visits my YouTube channel and sees my books and whatnot, they'll see every motorcade I could find of President Kennedy, 61 to 63, and it's alarming. In fact, I found a lot of newspaper articles, whatnot, and documents that corroborate cities that President Kennedy visited, where they matter-of-factly interview the chief of police, and he says, we're going to guard all the building rooftops, and my men will be there till the president passes. And it's pretty alarming, because the question is open: why wasn't this security allotted Kennedy when went to Dallas, a city he was warned about, giving a real prime example that really sticks out is the major motorcade before Dallas, before Texas, was Florida, specifically Tampa, Florida, November 18th, 4 days before. It was a 28-mile motorcade, almost 3 times the length of Dallas. Every multi-story building was guarded with heavily armed sheriff's department and military. I got this confirmed not only in documents released thanks to the Assassination Records Review Board, but I spoke to the lead motorcycle officer, Russell Groover, who told me that, oh, yes, Vince, every multi-story building rooftop was guarded to the teeth with heavily armed men. So I asked him, oh, that's great. But I thought to myself, okay, what about one-story dwellings? He says, well, those were guarded by the military and the police facing those buildings. So they were on an eye level with those buildings, so no problem there. So it's like, interesting. Agents were posted on the back of the car during those 28 miles. There was a military aide in the limousine. There was a lot of motorcycles flanking the limousine in good order. They were going very fast. There was a lot of detectives in the crowds themselves, plainclothes detectives. They had good intelligence. They found 6 pages of threats. You heard that right, 6 pages of threats, anti-Cuban, mafia, otherwise. And again, these only came out in the late 1990s thanks to the Assassination Review Board. We owe them a debt of gratitude. The Assassination Records Review Board releases from basically, give or take 93 to 95 onward, and scheduled releases through the years during the Trump-Biden era and so on have really been amazing for what they've revealed, what wasn't destroyed by the Secret Service. We'll get to that in a moment. But
Okay.
the big thing that I found, not only just about the building rooftops being guarded and motorcycles normally bracketing Kennedy's car in good number, is, and again, agents being on the back of the car, or at least close to the car. Kennedy had nothing to do with that. I alluded to this earlier when I spoke that night I spoke to the head of the White House detail, Gerald Bain. I spoke to his number 2 assistant, Floyd Boring. This is the brass, the top echelon, royalty of the Secret Service, where Gerald Blaine in his book Kennedy Detail was a buck private, only spent 5 years in the Secret Service, who was speaking for his colleagues who were long gone. I spoke to these gentlemen. I got them on audio tape. I got them in writing. And more importantly, all these films and photos have come out and have been digitally remastered and are available. It's only been the last 5 to 15 years. That's what sometimes people think, oh, what's more to talk about this case, Vince? We're, 60 years later, but it's fascinating. If you go back anywhere between 5 to 15 years, a lot of these films and photos weren't available. So it's like little me out there finding, wow, trip to Mexico. Look at all the agents in the back of the car. Bubble top, beautiful day. They go to Puerto Rico, same thing, all over the United States. And again, the $64 million question is, well, if they did all this before, Vince, why in Dallas, a city he was warned about, was he, basically a sitting duck? And that's what it boils down to. I found out, again, thanks to these films and photos, the bubble top, not only had President Kennedy had nothing to do with it, the follow-up car, Samuel Kinney, told me in 3 interviews I did in the early 1990s that he, Sam, was solely responsible for the bubble top's removal. Kennedy had nothing to do with it. Kenny O'Donnell had nothing to do with it. It's this mythology that they invoked on Kennedy after his death. They tried to say that he was reckless, that he had a rendezvous with death. Meantime, we all have a rendezvous with death. We're not immortal, but it makes kind of a romantic, kind of a Shakespearean tragedy stick on Kennedy afterward. Is that, oh, he was reckless with his security. There's no truth to that at all. That was the underlying theme of all the agents I spoke to and corresponded with. It's almost like they were reading cue cards. And I was a stranger. At the time, I was only in my late 20s, early 30s for the vast majority of these inquiries. And again, they were just telling me, oh, he was a very nice man. Vince never interfered with our actions at all. And other agents I spoke to from the more modern eras told me presidents have too much on their mind to think about. I wonder if Jack Jones is on the back of the car. They're not thinking about this thing. They're rehearsing their speech. They're thinking about national security and international matters. They're not thinking about, they're assuming the agents they trust them, sometimes to their detriment, that they're going to do the job. And normally a flatbed truck was in front of motorcades filming. It's amazing. There's been live television feeds when President Kennedy visited Rome, San Diego, the list goes on. We wouldn't need Abrams and Bruder. Normally, this flatbed trucks 1 to 2 were in front, and they were canceled the last minute at Love Field. Normally, Special Agent Bain or Boring, his number 2 assistant, were on the trips. But we have first major trip to Texas. Roy Kellerman's a 3rd stringer. And I always make the analogy, this would be like having a starting person in football or the Super Bowl. Oh, we're not going to have you guys sit down. We're going to have one of these 3rd stringers on the bench take the job for you. And again, it's a city that Kennedy was warned against. You have somebody like that, and yet the top brass wasn't there. And it was normally a military aide rode in the limousine between the driver and the agent in charge of the trip, Godfrey McHugh or Ted Clifton. Well, Godfrey McHugh was asked for the first time not to ride in the limousine. by the Secret Service. They wanted to accentuate full exposure. This came out in 1976 during a Canadian radio interview with Godfrey McHugh. He also, matter of factly, mentioned it to the House Select Committee in 1978, and they didn't do anything with it. And again, it wasn't until many years later, films and photos, and wow, on the Tampa trip, there's Godfrey McHugh sitting in front of the limousine. Now, obviously, he went in the path of bullets during the assassination 4 days later. Interestingly, he's not there. He's, as a professional eye near witness is gone. He's also out of the way for any kind of harm. That's why normally motorcycles are bracketed around the limousine in good number. As we know, or maybe this is new to some people, that, that morning during security meetings, and also the night before, Winston Lawson and David Grant of the Secret Service basically said, no, we don't need all these motorcycles beside the car. President Kennedy doesn't like these motorcycles beside the car. Well, when got Winston Lawson under oath, Alan Dulles asked him, was there an order from President Kennedy not to have agents beside the car, or I'm sorry, motorcycles beside the car? And Winston Lawson said, not in this specific instance, orders from President Kennedy.
Mm.
And then he quickly backtracked.
Sorry, can I just intervene there? I mean, so, there's obviously there was a protocol. You've seen multiple parades prior.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly many failings in the, before the actual shots, shall we say. We've got motorbike cops, we've got the bubble top, we've got the agents not on the back of the car, the parade route, Berkeley in the press bus, the other agent not in the front. There's maybe the trademark was a bad venue. There are multiple things here. Do you see this as a cumulative failing? Or is there one or two things that you just think are absolutely remarkable that they weren't present in Dallas?
Well, like I always tell people, not every single trip had a police state type of security. That's why they guarded building rooftops. There are some photos that have come out. We could see police on the rooftops. In fact, my new book will have them. And also, if you go to my YouTube channel, you'll see some of these things on there, some recent videos where you'll see yourself, and you'll see the newspaper articles confirming this. So what they did is by guarding building rooftops, like for when President Kennedy visited Paris, France, Charles de Gaulle, all the rooftops are guarded. In fact, the newspaper article, in addition to the photos showing the gendarme on the rooftops, says 10,000 police are going to be guarding President Kennedy during this trip. But the point is, how they did that was, they didn't always have agents on the back of the car, but the building rooftops guarded. They had many police and military line the streets facing the crowds, not facing the president, because then they're not doing any kind of security. As you know, when President Kennedy went to Dallas, the few police that were there were facing the motorcade, weren't facing the book depository, the other buildings, the crowds. So what I see, Neil, is just how many things fell through for Dallas, the Texas trip in general, and Dallas in particular. It'd be one thing if we were nitpicking about a few things, but it's so many things. Then when you juxtapose with the warnings he was getting by Senator Fulbright and other people, please don't visit Dallas, Mr. President. And we know about the wanted for treason signs. We know about the John Birch Society, the Ku Klux Klan, other people like Roy Kellerman of all people testified to the Warren Commission. He found it unusual that no threats were found to President Kennedy when they visited the intelligence files of the Secret Service. I mean, it's very unusual, to put it mildly, that nobody wished ill of the president and nothing was in their files. And somebody could argue maybe that was the official stance. They could say that that's the reason why security was lax. We didn't find anything.
Sorry, Vince, are you referring to the protective research section of the
PRS, Protective Research Section? And interestingly enough, there was an agent, Glenn Bennett, of the PRS Protective Research Section intelligence part of the Secret Service, riding in the follow-up car. And again, one of my discoveries only came out in the last 10 years or so. It turns out that Glenn Bennett was also on the Florida trip, was also on the New York trip, just joined the White House detail temporarily for the New York and Florida trips in November. He lied to the House Select Committee under oath. He said, I wasn't on the Florida trip. These documents only came out in the 1990s. Also, what came out in the 1990s are the shift reports that show that Glenn Bennett was on every part of President Kennedy's trip to Florida, and also a trip he didn't admit to, the one before New York, and on the Texas trip, riding in the follow-up car. So not only does he lie about it, he has a Secret Service lawyer with him during the House Select Committee interview, seated right next to him. I guess maybe he was thinking he was going to smell any kind of trouble, but the House Select Committee didn't realize the ramifications of all this. It just makes you think, why is a member of the intelligence part of the Secret Service riding in the follow-up car? My feeling is there were prior threats many threats to President Kennedy. This is a moving crime, and Glenn Bennett was there, as a couple other agents were on the Texas trip, to monitor threats in progress, to look out for gentlemen, to look out for people, plural, that wished ill of the president. And afterwards, this was covered up, that it was made to sound like, well, Glenn Bennett was temporarily added to the agency or to the White House detail due to a manpower pool, when there was no manpower pool. Again, it's only somebody like me who was researching these documents that only came out in the late 1990s onward. You find that, wow, why is he lying about being on these trips when he was on these trips? And it gets even further crazier than this, that in about 2007 or so, I found a local Baltimore, Maryland, United States newspaper, and Glenn Bennett's parents, this is 1963, are talking about how thrilled they are for Glenn Bennett, their son, to be in part of President Kennedy's motorcades, that he was on the New York, Florida, and Texas trip with the president. It's like, wow. So his parents even knew about it enough to talk to a local newspaper. Only came up because little old me found it in the newspaper archives. It's in my books. And again, it just makes you think, okay, why are they lying? Even Clint Hill, in his 2012 book, Mrs. Kennedy and Me, admitted Glenn Bennett was handling intelligence. And I'm sure to 99.9% of the readers, they just pass that by and where other things, but it makes me think, wow, okay, Clint Hill just basically confirmed my whole thing about Glenn Bennett, why he was there. You see, the thing is, if it's supposedly Oswald, or just a man all by himself and there's no conspiracy, why is there somebody there monitoring threats? Why are there other PRS agents on other parts of the Texas trip? Howard Norton, probably new names to your audience, Dale Wunderlich, another one. And Dale Wunderlich spoke for Howard Norton, who died many years before. And he said, yeah, he was the first technician of the Secret Service. He's the one who found bombs in resonance cavities. When we visited the United Nations, he found listening devices and whatnot. And Howard Norton was on the Florida and Texas trips. Again, this only came out in the late 1990s. It's only like little old me that would know what that name meant, because I was like, wait, Howard Norton, who is this? And so when I broached the subject to other people, it's, oh, yeah, he was a PRS agent. Yeah, he was on the Austin trip and he was on Florida and whatnot. But the overwhelming feeling I get when I see the films and photos of prior trips to President Kennedy, we will even skip FDR, Truman, and Eisenhower. There's definitely a security flow through those trips as well. But we'll just stick to Kennedy, 61 to 63 before Dallas. What I see is much heavier security. And again, I see building rooftops normally guarded. In fact, Ron Gardner, this is on my YouTube channel, before the entire world. This only came out in 2020. You talk about a new discovery. This is only 4 years ago during the COVID lockdown. A gentleman, friend of mine on YouTube, his channel unfortunately went under, but I was able to, thank God he shared the video with me. Here's Ron Gardner telling the entire world that, yeah, normally multi-story buildings are guarded, and as they've been guarded for many years, something like this, a tragedy like this, shouldn't happen. And he was telling everybody this, but again, you got to keep in mind, people were shocked. Kennedy's killed. Like my parents told me, 10 people get killed. Kennedy. We were so bereaved. The details went in one ear, not the other. This is before VCRs, before investigative reporting. So when Ron Gardner's telling these things, people aren't really making a mental note of things. They just know that President Kennedy's killed. It's not like now where everybody views things with the jaundiced eye and compares and contrasts and whatnot. This is a different matter, but the video is gold. It just corroborates the newspaper articles, the films, the photos. And again, a $64 million question is, if Dallas was a trip that President Kennedy was warned about, we know about the one over treason, et cetera, why weren't building rooftops guarded? Even if somebody out there believes Oswald acted alone, well, then the assassination would have been aborted. They would have been on the records building and the other ones. And officially they weren't. The official story is that stuff didn't happen until after the assassination. Only afterwards did we do things like that. It's patently false. It's not true. I have actually, in my third book, newspaper articles from the FDR and Truman days talking about building rooftops being guarded. So there you go. And also during the Eisenhower days too. But again, this took years and years, decades of combing through newspaper articles, archives. This took films and photos to be released, because again, I'd have been handicapped 15, 20 years ago because a lot of these motorcades, films and photos weren't released. In fact, I vividly remember the late 90s to early millennium, JFK Library had a real small amount of motorcade photos, to put it mildly, and you had to pay like $100, $200 for them. See, now there's countless. So it's real treasure trove. Yeah.
I just intervene there because obviously we're spending a lot of time on this section. Do you have any? What do you make of this notion that Greer and Kellerman didn't know where the nearest hospital was, or didn't really have any knowledge of the parade route? Is that true? I mean, if it is, it's remarkable.
Yeah, it's remarkable, and I'm very skeptical, to put it mildly, because on prior trips and whatnot, and Secret Service books were written before the assassination. Tellingly, the United States Secret Service, that's the title of the book, came out in 1960, written with the help of Michael Trina, who wrote the Secret Service manual. They matter of factly talk about, planning a motorcade usually 3 weeks in advance, and medical hospitals, whatnot, are checked out, just in case, God forbid, something happens. They would have a contingency. They'd know where it was located at. And as we know, uh, Bill Greer was briefly, actually for a fair amount, was leading the race to Parkland Hospital, yet he supposedly didn't know where it was at. That's the official story. And then the story is supposedly Chief Curry yelled to one of the motorcycle officers who got up ahead, and they led the race. But for a while, Bill Greer was leading the race to Parkland Hospital. But yes, you're right. The official story is, oh, we didn't know where Parkland was. We didn't know where the hospitals were. It's very suspicious, to put it mildly. And you mentioned Bill Greer. I mean, we'll get to this. I don't know what kind of order you want to get
Well,
into.
actually, just on that note, I mean, I think Bill Greer is a nice segue, because we're talking pre-assassination, into Camp David and Tom Shipman. Do you want to
Yes.
there'll probably be quite a few people here that don't know much about that. Would you?
Oh, sure. Um, Again, late 1990s, the Assassination Review Board era was a really golden era for me, and I'm sure many other authors and researchers. But what it was there was a book by, I'll keep this brief. George McNally was the head of the White House Communication Agency, or WICA, WHCA. He was one on all the motorcades, made sure the radio channels were free for security and whatnot, channel 1, channel 2, whatnot. So he was on many motorcades from Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy days, and afterwards LBJ and Nixon, as a member of the Secret Service, later as WICA. He died in 1970, but his widow came out with this book he was writing at the time of his death in 1970, came out in 1982, called A Million Miles of Presidents. And if you're familiar with Andy Wynarzyk's Last Straw Bookshop, he had copies, and other people in the research community know about the book. But getting to the heart of the matter, this book is a non-index book, fascinating book, talk about various trips of Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy. I get to the fall of 63 in the book, and it just says, matter of factly, Thomas Shipman, one of President Kennedy's drivers, died suddenly. And it's the late 1990s. I'm like, who's Thomas Shipman? He died suddenly? And through interviewing agents and documents that came out and so forth, turns out Thomas Shipman died October 14th, 1963, of an alleged heart attack at Camp David. He's the only person ever to die at Camp David. He's the only agent from the Kennedy era. And everybody talks about this mysterious deaths after the assassination. This happened about a month before the assassination at Camp David, one of President Kennedy's drivers. He would have been there in Dallas. And I can say, Vince, how can you be so bold to say he would have been the driver? How do we know? There was a couple other driver agents, weren't there? When I interviewed Laura Shipman, his daughter, his only daughter, she didn't rain on my parade. She basically corroborated things. I thought, oh, there's an old lawyer adage. Don't ask questions you don't know the answer to, because somebody could tell you, Vince, you're full of it. There's no truth to this. He died of a heart attack. They could have said, oh, he had heart ailments for years, Vince. They said the opposite. He's passed an annual physical. He's fit as a fiddle, and he dies of a heart attack at Camp David. But the point is, they had family and relatives in Dallas. He was looking forward to the Texas trip, specifically Dallas, to drive President Kennedy. His surviving family, his grandson and other ones, reached out to me only after I found them. They didn't seek remuneration or fame or nothing. They were obscure before and were obscure after. And he just matter of factly said that they thought it was very strange. They always bothered him, his sudden death. And they said that, in my opinion, too, that if Thomas Shipman would have driven President Kennedy in Dallas, I think history would have been changed for the better. I think President Kennedy would have lived. And just the fact that he was admired. In fact, if anybody's seen the most famous footage of Thomas Shipman out there, there's several motorcades, but the one of when Patrick Kennedy, the Kennedy, there's footage from Boston, that area, and he's the driver. You can see him real prominently in films and photos. But not to digress, the point is, this only came out in the late 1990s onward. There used to be, this is really crazy, there used to be a Secret Service official roll call of all the agents who passed away through the years. Keep in mind, there's now been tens of thousands of agents since the 19th century. Only 37 have died in the line of duty. He's the only one from the Kennedy era. At first, he wasn't listed. Then when I started to have online articles talking about him back in 2001, all of a sudden, his name's added to the roll call. And again, agents I spoke to before this roll call online were telling me, oh, yeah, Thomas Shipman, he was one of President Kennedy's drivers. In fact, if you turn to the Blaine Hill books, they never mention his death. They never say anything about an agent passing away, but he's mentioned in the photo section of Gerald Blaine's book. He's on one of the trips, actually just a couple weeks before he died. But you talk about a mysterious death that I find very suspicious, because Bill Greer, he's one of my three suspects. Bill Greer, when the shooting began, he looked back at Kennedy, which he denied ever doing. He said he never saw Kennedy. Okay. Roy Kellerman, his superiors, tell him, get out of line. We've been hit. Bill Greer's been properly trained. He has common sense. He knows what's going on. He's hearing things. He's seeing Kennedy react with his fists and whatnot by his throat. He's hearing all this. He disobeys a direct order, looks back at Kennedy a second time until the fatal shot makes its mark. Only then does he face forward, hit the gas when it's all over. He denied all this to the Warren Commission. But yet that day at Parkland Hospital, Kenny O'Donnell in his book and others have said that Bill Greer was very remorseful. He actually said to Jacqueline Kennedy, oh, Mrs. Kennedy, if only I'd seen it sooner. Oh. But that night to the FBI, he started to change his tune. To Seibert and O'Neill at Bethesda, he said, there were times that President Kennedy ordered us to slow down. So it's like, oh, you're going to shift the blame to President Kennedy now that he's safely out of the way. That's what they started to do. There was a shift to President Kennedy. At first, the initial stories were President Kennedy never interfered with our actions, but then they started for the official Warren Commission. They started to change the tune and try to blame President Kennedy. But back to Greer, even people like Posner and Bugliosi have conceded that if Bill Greer does his job, in their opinion, they think it's Oswald, the assassination's aborted because he swerves the car, he hits the gas. Again, he looks back not once but twice. In fact, in 1991, that Fredonia conference, my first major conference presentation, age of 25, a lot of seasoned researchers, Harry Livingstone, Robert Cutler, George Michael Evica, et cetera, were in the audience. Says, Vince, I never noticed that Greer looks back twice. Back in 1991, these grizzled authors and researchers never noticed. Now, I think a lot of people have, but back then he didn't notice he looked back twice. And again, Roy Kellerman's face in him, you could see, and Roy Kellerman's Warren Commission testimony says, get out of line, we've been hit. And he gets the radio microphone to radio the cars. That's when Greer turns back around, staring at Kennedy, against common sense, against training, against the order. In fact, Roy Kellerman spoke to William Manchester, the death of president. It's buried in a footnote, but Roy Kellerman told William Manchester, Greer then looked in the back of the car. Maybe he didn't believe me. So it's pretty damning for Greer. And then Neil, I talked about this a week ago. I'll tell your audience that back in 2013, the Irish Times, of all things, reached out to me because they were fascinated by my research on Bill Greer, because Bill Greer was originally born in Ireland, County Tyrone, Ireland. Turns out Bill Greer was part of the Order of the Orange. Him and his family were deeply, so you know that whole thing about Protestants and Catholics and all the bloody wars we've had and the religious thing. Well, he wore that on his sleeve. And how I know that is, although Bill Greer died in 1985, I spoke to his son, Richard, in 1991, and I asked him some innocuous questions. One of them I asked him, I said, sir, what did your father think of President Kennedy? The line went silent. It's like, okay, this is very awkward, I'm thinking, but I quickly recovered and asked him some other things, which he was very willing to discuss. Then I went back to his father's feelings about President Kennedy. I said, sir, if you don't mind, what did your father think of President Kennedy? And he said, well, we're Methodist. JFK was Catholic.
On that note,
pretty strange.
On that note, yeah. Vince, I ought to give the audience an opportunity, but that's pretty much you're stumbling into the performance in Dallas now. But
sure.
Does anybody want to ask a question? Yes, Paul.
Yeah. Hi, Vince.
Speak loud. Yeah.
Hi, Vince.
Hi.
I'd like to ask about the actual speed after the first shot was fired, and they maybe thought it was a firecracker. That nobody, there was about maybe 10 of them was a Secret Service. Nobody actually did anything, did they? Even when Kennedy has his hands on his throat. I mean, why did nobody move?
Why indeed? And what it boils down to is, if you've seen my appearance on A Coup in Camelot, I basically, and it's also in my books, that when the shooting began, one of my other suspects is Emory Roberts. He was the shift leader, the commander of the agents in the follow-up car, 5 feet away from President Kennedy's car. He orders the agents not to move when the shooting begins. C.M. Kinney, the driver of the follow-up car, matter-of-factly confirms to me in the early 1990s, he was sitting a foot away from Emory Roberts. He said, exactly right. I said, what? He was exactly right. Yeah, he ordered the other agents not to move. And then I guess realizing the ramifications, he said, well, Emory probably didn't want to hurt Jack Reddy and the other agents. You know, if they jumped out the car, I could have ran them over. That's ridiculous, because the whole reason for existing are for the agents to cover and evacuate, to cover President Kennedy. They should have been in the back of the car, which is another story. But even being handicapped by being 5 feet away, they should have lunged forward, even if it would have been in vain. And to answer your question about the speed of the car, yeah, they were going 11.2 miles an hour, but there was a time they were going a little slower than that. It's basically the speed of pulling out of a parking space is how fast they were going. And again, I don't believe Oswald acted alone, but this is even for skeptics out there somewhere to believe Oswald acted alone. As even Posner and Bugliosi have conceded, if Greer hits the gas and or these agents did their job, Kennedy lives. And again, when you think about all the things that were taken away from Kennedy that day on the trip in general, but Dallas in particular, and juxtapose it with prior trips, threats to President Kennedy, he knew. In fact, he even said, we're entering nut country now. And the famous story that he supposedly said the night before to Jacqueline, boy, last night would have been a hell of a night to assassinate a president. So President Kennedy was preoccupied with death. That part's true. In fact, it's even in Ralph Martin's book, A Hero for a Time. When President Kennedy returned from the Florida trip a few days before Dallas, he said, thank God nobody wanted to kill me. He said to Dave Powers. Pretty alarming thing. So President Kennedy knew about the threats. The Secret Service knew about the threats. Yet he gets to Texas, Dallas in particular, and security stripped. If they would have hit the gas, if they would have been by the car, motorcycles would have been more professional eye and ear witnesses, more professional eye and ear witnesses in front of the car with the films and foes. We would have needed Abraham Zapruder, building rooftops being guarded, grassy knoll, fake or real agents wouldn't have been here. That's another story. So, yeah.
All right. I've got one more question from Johnny Cairns.
Hi, Matilda. Quick question. I see a lot of people now want to try and prolong the shooting sequence. Some people believe it was 8 seconds, 9 seconds, as to the kind of widely accepted 6 seconds. But surely if the shooting sequence is stretched out even further to 9 or 10 seconds, doesn't that then call into even more question on the Secret Service?
You exactly right, sir. You could frame what you said. That's exactly right. The more seconds you are allotting the agency to react, then it makes their actions and inactions even worse. In fact, back in 1996 with Tink Thompson in the audience, who was very impressed with this little bit I juxtaposed the March 30th, 1981 assassination attempt on President Reagan with the Zapruder film. Now, they only had like 6 or 7 seconds for the assassination attempt against President Reagan. All they had was their agile minds, fleetness of foot. And yet Jerry Parr, who I spoke to, the head of Reagan's detail, pushed Reagan into the limousine. There was an agent, Tim McCarthy, who took a bullet to the stomach that would have meant for President Reagan. They reacted stupendously, and President Reagan lived. And you juxtapose that to the Zapruder film, you got Greer looking back once, actually twice, not once, but twice. He had Tom Shipman the month before dies at Camp David, given an opportunity to drive and his suspicious feelings about Kennedy. You have Emory Roberts, the commander of the agents, who in these perplexing seconds, he's telling them not to move. He's the shift leader. He's the boss of the other agents. In fact, we didn't get a chance to get to it, but very quickly, I discovered this back in 1991. I'm the one who actually discovered out of raw footage from ABC of the famous clip from the motorcade leaving Love Field, and an agent's jogging along with the motorcade. It's Don Lawton. Before that was Henry Ribga, who only appears in the newsreels. But anyway, Emory Roberts rises from his seat in the front passenger seat of the fob car and goes like this and waves Don Lawton away. Emory Roberts does, and Don Lawton 3 times raises his hand, which is basically the universal sign of what gives. And for years, I showed this on the Men Who Killed Kennedy, coup in Camelot and whatnot, and they try to, Clint Hill and other people try to put a innocent spin on this, that supposedly Don Lawton says, well, I'm heading to lunch, guys. Have a good trip. But Don Lawton came out in the early, like about 2012 and whatnot, through a friend of his. It was a local Idaho newspaper, said, I should have been there. I should have been on the back of the car. So it's interesting that he conveys to a friend of his that he should have been in the back of the car. In case you wondered, Don Lawton passed away around that time, and it was a tribute article to him in a newspaper. And so it just, so there you go.
Sorry, Vince, just in the interest of time, I've got another question from Scott Reed.
Sure. Oh, Scott, how you doing?
Hi, Vince. Vince, I've asked you this question before, but I'm just going to ask again just for others to get your perspective on it. And I appreciate you, it's an opinion really I'm just asking for, but Kennedy having done so many motorcades and understanding, how they operated and what the protection should be, it makes me wonder, did he have suspected there's something not right here? While he's going along Dallas, that, the people aren't in the right places, you know, there aren't enough people here? I mean, do you think he would have ever suspected or sniffed that there's something not quite right?
My answer to that is probably an unsatisfying yes and no. Because again, what I said a couple of minutes ago that Dave Powers was interviewed, and Dave Powers said that when Kennedy came back from the Florida trip, he said, "Thank God no one wanted to kill me today." And obviously, the night before, talking about assassinations and whatnot. But the thing is, President Kennedy told San Antonio Congressman Henry Gonzalez the day before the assassination, "The Secret Service told me they took care of everything, Henry. There's nothing to worry about." And Democratic National Committee advance man Marty Underwood said that, again, the night before, this time in Houston, when Marty Underwood voiced his concerns, President Kennedy said, "Marty, you worry about me too much." So pretty amazing. And again, when you harken back to something I said 15 minutes ago or so, presidents are focused on rehearsing their speech in their mind. They're focused on national security events, other things. They're trusting, sometimes to their detriment, the agents around, just like President Trump, former President Trump, a couple months ago, trusted the Secret Service. They did a terrible job in Pennsylvania, and he was almost killed. Well, they trust the men who are guarding them. So sometimes that trust could be ill-founded, and I think it's a question of, no, President Kennedy had a bad back, stiff back. He couldn't look back to see if agents were back there or not. He trusted them in their security. Up to that point, he survived motorcades. Okay, I guess they're doing what they're doing, and they're going on to the Trade Mart, and they're flying by, and he's waving to people. He's not realizing certain things aren't done, and sadly, the assassination was a success. So, yeah.
Okay. If you could answer briefly, there's another couple of questions related to this section.
Hi, Vince, Pete Miller. You didn't sort of touched on this, but just to confirm, Captain Lawrence, DPD, was in charge of setting up the motorcade security on the Dallas Police side of things, and he attended a meeting in his Warren Commission testimony. This was Thursday, probably tea time-ish, pretty late, and he didn't give a name, but he said a Secret Service agent was at that meeting, and he was instructed that the president didn't want any motorcycles at the side of the thing, but to have 4 motorcycles behind. And Lawrence's plans are written out on a Warren Commission exhibit where he's got 8 motorcycles, and also on the Friday morning, leaving the Hotel Texas, going through Fort Worth. I've got a photograph of Kennedy's limousine leading the way like it did in Dallas. There's 8 motorcycles, 4 on either side of that. The question, are you certain that the Secret Service agent that instructed Lawrence was Winston Lawson?
It's either Winston Lawson or it's David Grant, who was the lead advance agent with him, who came from the Florida trip late. It's one of those two, or it's both. Interesting, not again a tangent, but David Grant was Clint Hill's brother-in-law, in case you're wondering about that. But matter of factly, David Grant came from the Florida trip. So if people want to give Winston Lawson an odd, say poor Winston Lawson, it's not his fault. David Grant came fresh from the Florida trip. He's definitely a suspect. Comes down to those 2 agents. And again, when Win Lawson's testifying under oath to the Warren Commission, he's asked, he says, not specifically in this instance, orders from him to not have motorcycles beside the car. But again, he caught himself as well. It's my understanding on prior trips that he didn't want all those motorcycles beside the car. Again, it wasn't until many years later through films, photos, and interviews, we found out, wow, on the prior Texas stops, he had many motorcycles. You should see the films and photos from San Antonio and Houston. It's outrageous. It's actually conservative at 8 for Fort Worth, the trip before. In San Antonio, Houston, he had just a gaggle, a parade of motorcycles surrounding the car. It's incredible. I mean, it's just unbelievable how many motorcycles he had. And again, these are professional, armed, eye-and-ear witnesses, law enforcement that would have seen something out of whack. They would have been able to return fire, whatnot. They're out of harm's way. And at that insult to injury, they went from 8 down to 4. They're moved beside the rear wheels of the limousine. So they were totally, as we see this Zapruder film, you don't even see the motorcycles beside Kennedy because they're moved out of the way. And it's getting like the military aide in the front seat who's not there. Well, they moved out of harm's way for some reason. So,
All right, Vince,
yeah.
sorry, I need to intervene. I wanted to just try and press on. There's one more question in this area. Tony Basing?
Yeah, hi. Doug Hall, in his book, reported an interview that a researcher had done, which was recorded with an Air Force One steward. And he was assisting Clint Hill change his clothing, his shirt, etc., etc. Clint Hill obviously in shock at the time. And he reported that Clint Hill had said, as soon as I jumped on the car, I was faced by the driver holding a hand. And something I've always sort of dismissed in the past. But he then goes into just, how shocked Clint Hill was after the event turned to alcohol, could mental depression years after. But a little while before reading that extract, I found a quote saying, of Clint Hill, saying, I couldn't bear to tell Jackie that JFK was a traitor. And whereas I put notes down throughout Doug Hall's book, I thought this was so...
Someone reached out to me about that recently, that specific question. Yeah. I don't know where that comes from.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That was my question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's right, Neil. You're the one who told me about that. I'll be honest with you, I don't know where that comes from. I don't know, because that's news to me. Yeah, I don't know what to think of that. Well, I can tell you one thing. This is based on years of research and whatnot. Bill Greer was one of my 3 major suspects of the Secret Service, but I don't think he shot anybody. This whole thing about him turning around and shooting Kennedy, no. He's a suspect without him firing a gun. Clear copies of the Zapruder film, other films.
Anyway, you've got missing frames, order of frames in the wrong place. You've got black matte inserts on the head shots and all sorts of things.
That's compelling. I agree with you, sir, on that. It's the back of the head,
Great deal of detail and make sure it's evidentiary. Whereas this particular comment, he was very wary about saying about Greer, because he said, well, it's hearsay. It's come from a very well-known researcher who recorded the interview, but doesn't want to release all of the details. And he then went in to say, well, actually, look at the impact on poor old Clint Hill at the time. I mean, he apparently reported the assets, the security stream, to Arlen Specter verbally. And then in his written testimony, he reported the same thing, but left out, for example, one of the agents involved's name. When he was asked by the committee to produce it. And
and I tell you one thing, one bit of good news about the traitor remark is there is an agent, Elmer Moore, who's one of my other suspects on a lower level. Elmer Moore is famous for saying that President Kennedy was a traitor. He said that. He said that to James Galchiner, who just passed away recently, a researcher in 1970, Elmer Moore. Elmer Moore was the one who interviewed the Parkland Hospital doctors who changed their, tried to get them to change their feelings about the entrance wound to Kennedy, whatnot. So Elmer Moore's on records calling Kennedy a traitor.
And there's more than that. It's something that's emerged over the last few years or so, that you do find out some of these Secret Service agents or FBI agents or whatever saying, well, he was a traitor. And I actually believe that it was dressed up that way in order to create circumstances where they could kill Kennedy and sort of get away with it without going into too much detail. But what I can't find so annoying is this quote. And I thought it was either from Lisa McCarthy's book or one of your books that also was looking at the details of the video, or something like The Brothers, or a similar similar novel.
Right, if we could move on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we've done one section in 52 minutes, so we're on track.
Sorry,
So, I
I
mean,
ramble.
I knew this would go this way, Vince. I'd already, it's in line with expectations. So, we're now moving on to the performance in Dallas and Fort Worth, and we've started to look at what actually happened in Dealey Plaza. But can we go back to the previous night and let's get your views on the press club and the cellar shenanigans? I mean, you've got 17 agents that were drinking in those clubs, 10 of whom were in the cellar, and I think 4 of those were Landis, Hill, Reddy, and Bennett.
Right.
All of whom were in the Queen Mary. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's quite a shocking thing. I mean, and I really like your insight. I mean, was this just, getting in too late, or were they?
No, this.
Were some of these guys intoxicated? What's your
Yes, they were. Yeah, a couple press people that I interviewed. It's in my first book, Survivor's Guilt. Matter of factly confirmed that no, these men were definitely drinking alcohol. Like, there was a little bit of a limited hangout when the Secret Service investigated, because Drew Pearson, I think it was, or I forget his name right now, the investigative reporter, came up with an article and made major headlines, talk about the Secret Service should be investigated. There's reports that they were drinking the night before. What happened was they went drinking at the Fort Worth Press Club. They were also looking for food. And then they went to the cellar as well, which is a nightclub. Now, the cellar technically didn't serve alcohol. What they did is they provided fruit juice chasers, and then the agents themselves had the alcohol, or the alcohol was given to them off the record. But between both places, they were drinking, and 9 agents admitted drinking the night before at these 2 establishments. 4 of them rode in the follow-up car, one of them being Clint Hill, the other one Jack Reddy, Glenn Bennett. You name them all. Yes, Paul Landis also. That's grounds for dismissal from the Secret Service. That's even in Warren Commission Volume 18. There's a page from the Secret Service manual that says drinking while in travel status with the president is grounds for removal, will be strictly forbidden. These men were not punished in any way whatsoever. In fact, one of them, Clint Hill, was promoted and decorated. He got the opposite of it all. So it's just incredible. And when his finest moment was Chief Justice Earl Warren put Chief Raleigh, he was grilled under oath and said, why were these men put to this beatnik club? Why were they drinking the night before? They should have been in bed. This is terrible for their reflexes as well, sleep deprivation as well. And Chief Raleigh actually said, I don't think these men could have prevented the assassination. I didn't want to stigmatize their families and whatnot. But today, these men would be either figuratively or literally hung. They'd lose their jobs. We saw what happened back in 2012 at Cartagena, Colombia. President Obama, 9 agents, that number 9 again, were drinking crowds the night before. They were dismissed from the agency. Yet in 1963, we lose a president. They're not punished at all. In fact, one's promoted, Clint Hill. In fact, he's considered a hero to many today, as like 4 books, something crazy like that. He married his co-author. But the bottom line is, yes, sleep deprivation is terrible. They report for duty at 8 a.m. Paul Landis admitted he didn't go to bed till 5:30, or actually, no, he didn't leave till 5:30. Who knows if he even went to sleep? Alcohol and sleep deprivation wreak havoc on anybody's reflexes, let alone these men. So, yeah, you have the gross negligence. They should have been let go, punished just for that. President's assassinated and it's covered up. It's, again, 1963 to 64 is a different time. This is before Woodward and Bernstein, private investigator, as far as like investigative journalism, tabloids and whatnot, all that. And people had a tendency to believe the word of their government. There wasn't the internet. So there was nothing for people to base things off other than official government radio and television and newspaper pronouncements. So there might have been some old lady somewhere in Idaho that was mad about them drinking the night before. What's she going to do about it? Go to her job and life goes on. Again, today that wouldn't fly. Look what happened in Cartagena, Colombia. But again, it was all covered up. That's why Robert Groden famously told me, I guess that's why the Secret Service is secret. He never focused on the Secret Service. A lot of people didn't. They're considered the good guys. Most people think of the FBI Director Hoover as evil and the CIA as an evil connotation. Most people think of the Secret Service, think, well, those are the good guys. They're there to protect them. Hey, so that's why people kind of like overlooked them for a long time. And that's why. And again, at the same token, I'm not trying to say there was a Secret Service conspiracy. Most of these men were fine or they were just following orders. All it takes is a few bad apples. And yeah, that drinking incident is terrible. And actually something that made mainstream press at the time, but it was covered up. So it was just a matter of the times we lived in back in 63, 64, unfortunately. Yeah. So
I think you'll be pleased to know that the Internal Secret Service investigation stated that none of them were intoxicated, Vince.
yeah, ridiculous.
All right.
You know.
Well, let's move on to the post-assassination behaviour and events. How do you feel about their behaviour at Parkland, Vince?
Yeah, well, like I said, I'll just briefly tell you in the context of the Parkland situation that 3 of my suspects are Bill Greer, the driver of the limousine, Emery Roberts, who will focus on Parkland. He was the agent in charge of the agents of the fob car 5 feet away, and Floyd Boring is my 3rd suspect. He was the planner of the Texas trip from the Secret Service point of view. I think he's the genesis for a lot of things that did not happen. They get to Parkland Hospital. Emery Roberts is on record telling Roy Kellerman, his boss, "You stay with Kennedy. I'm going to Johnson." And he had his men then go cover President Johnson. Kennedy is still technically alive. They don't know that. They're supposed to guard the president. He's not. I know now we see it in the film. He's basically dead, but he's still technically alive. They're supposed to still follow their charge. But even if you want to say, hey, Vince, come on, he was basically killed on Elm Street. Okay, fair enough. Roy Kellerman is Emery Roberts' boss, and he's telling him what to do. And that's why I always say the absence of Gerald Bain and Floyd Boring, the number 1 and number 2 agents on this Texas trip, was really detrimental, because certain things that did not happen wouldn't have flown. They would have noticed, why aren't men guarding these building rooftops during pre-planning? Why was this motorcade doing what it's doing? Why weren't agents posting the back car, et cetera, et cetera? In fact, Gerald Bain took his first full vacation during the Kennedy era, 3 years during that weekend of the Florida and Texas trips. That was confirmed by Clint Hill and Gerald Blaine in their books years after I discovered it. But anyway, they went to Parkland. Okay, they did what they did. Emery Roberts takes charge over his boss. They illegally steal the body from the county coroner. Back then, it's hard to believe now, but back then, the murder of a president was the state crime, not a federal crime. Only the murder of a Secret Service agent, that was a federal crime. And interestingly enough, as we know, there was newspaper, television, radio reports that a Secret Service agent was also killed today along with the president. I think that was phony. I think that was to invoke federal jurisdiction for a time so they could say that's the reason why they took the body away. Then lo and behold, oh, we're mistaken. An agent wasn't killed that day. I have a video on my YouTube channel, countless clips, ABC, NBC, CBS, all the networks and these newspaper articles too, talking matter-of-factly about an agent being killed that day. But again, gives them federal jurisdiction when they didn't have it. That's why for autopsy should have been done at Parkland. If they would have had the autopsy at Parkland, the show would have been over. No Oswald, no nothing. They would have found all the people that said the back of the head was gone. The one that said the throat wound was an entrance wound. In fact, we can thank Alex Harris, a young researcher discovered ABC, although we already technically knew this from newsreels. He found an ABC clip of Malcolm Perry speaking that night, the night of the press conference that was confiscated by the Secret Service. We can't see. We just have a transcript from the LBJ library. And Malcolm Perry's telling the newsman this was an entrance wound, and he wound a bad cavity in the right posterior area. So for Earl Rose, who did a tremendous autopsy on J.D. Tippit, he does the same kind of autopsy on President Kennedy at Parkland. The show is over. The conspiracy is exposed, but they steal the body, hijack at the Air Force One. LBJ, is basically a getaway. He's sworn in. It wasn't necessary to do that. They could have took Air Force Two as well. Both planes are basically the same as Kenny O'Donnell said. Kenny O'Donnell came out and said, I did not give President Johnson authority or my acquiesce to go take Air Force One. That was all invented after the fact to cover for their actions and whatnot. So yeah, they the secret, and also about the limousine. I know you wanted to get into that too, Neil.
Yeah,
the limousine.
Subject, yeah.
Yeah, the limousine. There was a medical person I spoke to as well. Of course, one with Avelia Glanges. She was on the medical Kennedy. Said that there was a hole in the windshield. There was several Dallas police officers that noted a hole in the windshield. Not to get ahead of ourselves, but the limousine made to the White House garage, there was at least 2 Secret Service agents, Charles Taylor and Joe Palella, that said there was a hole in that windshield. Now, the ramifications for that as official history is, oh, that's just a crack from a rearward bullet, probably Oswald's bullet. That's the official story. That was a through and through hole. The game's over. That's probably how Kennedy got the throat entrance wound. At the very least, it's another shot, probably from the front, that was covered up afterwards. As we know, the late Doug Weldon, attorney, he was on the men who killed Kennedy, and he has a great chapter in Murder in Dealey Plaza. And he details all this about how there was witnesses. There was actually a Ford Motor Company witness that saw the hole in the windshield as well. He didn't want remuneration. He wanted this released after his death, and Doug Weldon obeyed his wishes. And there it was. There's an audio tape that was played in the men who killed Kennedy, as well as this letter. It talks about how they saw a hole and they were ordered to destroy the windshield. They put a new one in. You know, the story was the craziest thing about the limousine is, why would they use the limousine again? That's tantamount to using Abraham Lincoln's bloody chair at Ford's Theater. Oh, mate, we'll just fix this up, and hey, the future presidents could sit and enjoy this chair. They didn't do that. They kept it at Ford's Theater as a kind of macabre artifact of the assassination of John Wilkes Booth. But there you go. And yet the limousine, the government couldn't afford a new limousine. They take it away. They bulletproof it. They put on, a permanent bubble top, then obviously change the windshield, and Johnson wouldn't ride in it until it was painted black, because it was midnight blue before that. And there's actually films and photos I have on my YouTube channel of LBJ using this limousine. But again, it's a moving crime scene. Why on earth did he just use a new limousine? I think it's part of the whole cover-up. This story's now, this is extremely hard to believe that the limousine, the bloody limousine, was driven to Dearborn, Michigan, 500 miles away. It was driven, sure. It was flown from Dallas to D.C. on a C-130 transport plane. I actually corresponded with a member of the C-130 transport plane that confirmed that they found the back of President Kennedy's head in the back of the limousine and whatnot. But the point is, it was flown there. We're supposed to believe it was driven 500 miles to Dearborn, Michigan, then back to Cincinnati, Ohio at Hessen-Eisenhardt for being revamped and refurbished. Now, there's another story. It was driven straight to Dearborn. There was no Hessen-Eisenhower detour. But the bottom line is, it's very hard to believe in front of the public. They had to stop at gas stations 500 miles. I would have to get refill, and people aren't saying, my Lord, that's President Kennedy's limousine. They're really going to do that. But again, this is before the internet, for investigative journalism. People didn't question things like they do now back then. So it was basically taken as, I wouldn't say gospel, but there was conflicting stories as well. So the bottom line is, that's what we're supposed to believe. It was driven for hundreds of miles, or it was taken to Ohio. Take your pick, either Detroit, Michigan, or Ohio, or both. But the bottom line is,
sorry, Vince,
the damage.
Vince, you think it was flown out on Sunday night?
Yes, I do. I definitely think, just as it was flown from Texas to Washington, I think it was flown to Dearborn, Michigan. There was no driving. I think the reason why they had this cover story is there were certain specific agents and people they didn't want to be involved in the changes. They didn't want them known, so they didn't have to testify what they saw or didn't see. So they wanted to keep it like, oh, was this? This is Carl Rainis, who claims that he drove the limousine. Then there's someone else from the Ford Motor Company claims he drove it. It's much conflict. That's why so much of this case, there's so much conflict. There's so many people that say one thing, and then there's another tale, and nothing meshes. But the bottom line, they would have flown that. If they flew on a C-130 transport plane, they would have flew it on a C-130 transport, because they wanted to invoke any further damage or this macabre situation of the president was assassinated in this car, my God, and they're going to drive it? Come on, this is just ridiculous. But the bottom line, as far as an evidentiary standpoint, limousine, windshield, the whole, that's where skull particles and bullet fragments were found, allegedly, pointing to Oswald, allegedly. And we know one of the people that literally had their hands in the car was a former OSS man who worked hand in glove with James Jesus Angleton and Ray Roca, the liaisons for the Warren Commission. So it's pretty crazy. If you're grist for the mill, certainly leads to suspicion of all people, it's this guy. And again, during the 1950s, Paul Paterny was especially in charge of the Secret Service Chicago office. Guy Bannister was in charge of the Secret Service or the FBI office in Chicago. So the two had to know each other. Your federal compadres, because you have to work with each other for check forgery cases, presidential threats, etc. They knew each other. So Again, Paul Paternity, who knows Guy Bannister, say that these connections are just crazy. So if anybody is suspicious about the bullet fragment we know Dr. Young came out in the year 2000 for the Gerald Ford oral history, and Dr. Young, matter of factly, said that he found a bullet on the back seat of the limousine. We know about Paul Landis' story last year and made great fanfare in his book about finding the magic bullet on top of the back seat. All these stories show you the chain of possession was terrible. Oswald or anybody else would have never been convicted of. He would have lived past Jack Ruby shooting him. The chain of possession was awful. Nothing makes sense. Multiple bullets, multiple skull fragments, a hole in the windshield, then it's not there. And again, these aren't crackpots. These aren't conspiracy theorists. These are law enforcement people. These are people with no axe to grind would say these things. So it's not like, oh, come on, Vince, it's some guy writing a book who's saying this. No, that's the thing. It's like backtrack to the agents I spoke to. I'm just some stranger, on the street, talking on the phone with them or writing. There's some young whippersnapper. Why would they lie to me? On the one hand, a lot of them believed Oswald acted alone. It's time to move on. But then they said President Kennedy never wore herself the car, never wore the bubble top off, et cetera, not realizing the ramifications. I always say the truth comes out. You can only hold a lie for so long. Maybe in the first few years after the assassination, if I tried to speak to these guys back then, time traveling, they would have said, no comment, or no, it's what the Warren report says. But years later, they're in retirement, they're relaxed. Yeah, of course, President Kennedy never told us to do that. And when it's corroborated, too. So if it was just one guy in the wilderness, you say, Vince, come on. But when it's corroborated, that's why I always sought corroboration, because I always know what the other side does. They're like, you got to think like a defense attorney. But yeah, so the limousine is just crazy, just from an evidentiary standpoint.
Do you think, going back to the windshields, you call them, are you a fan of the idea that the Arlington company replaced the windshield at the White House garage, or do you just think it went straight to Ford? And do you believe in the sort of George Whitaker story? What's your stance on the windshield?
Yeah, the George Whitaker's, because Doug Weldon, the late Doug Weldon, again, Men Who Killed Kennedy and Murder Dealey Plaza, his chapter, it's fascinating stuff, and I won't want to cast any aspersions or say that his research, because I think his research is very compelling. I'm open to either, that it could have been a windshield switch at the White House garage that night, technically the 23rd past midnight, or it was done at the Ford Motor Company. Either way, he's fine, because the bottom line is the windshield was replaced. In fact, Roy Kellerman, when he testified to the Warren Commission, our inspector asked him, because allegedly they had the windshield, and Roy Kellerman says, it feels rather smooth today. And Orange says, it feels different. He goes, yes, it does. As opposed to saying, oh, looks and feels the same to me, sir. He says, it feels rather different. And again, that just grist for the mill of a change and whatnot. And again, it's all a matter of chain of possession. It's all about the evidentiary things. Again, Oswald or anybody else never would have stood trial for this, because it was just a mess from a chain of possession standpoint, and how things conveniently were done. The body was stolen, no autopsy done by the Secret Service. The Secret Service had the limousine, the bullet fragments, skull particles. Sam Kinney, matter of fact, tells me he has the back part of Kennedy's head on the C-130 transport plane in the back of limousines. There was like a flower pot, clean as a pin. This thing was. Oh, it was big. And yet he believes Oswald was the lone shooter. But he did believe there was a conspiracy, but he thought Oswald was the only shooter. But the bottom line is he had the back part of Kennedy's head, but he didn't realize the ramifications for it, because in his mind, Oswald was the only shooter. So that's why things are compartmentalized. Like Governor Connolly never believed the single bullet theory, but he thought Oswald acted alone. Sometimes people don't realize, Clint Hill and Paul Landis came out in 2016, same year, to denounce the single bullet theory, but they still believe Oswald acted alone. See, again, people don't realize sometimes there are ramifications. You can't have one without the other. You got to, weigh and consider. So, yeah.
What about moving on to Bethesda? Do you have any strong opinions on the behavior of Kellerman and Greer at Bethesda?
Yes, I do. Greer and Kellerman, as we know, were in the limousine when Kennedy's killed. They're at Parkland, when Kennedy, the life-saving resuscitation measures, are seeing Kennedy there as well. They get to Bethesda, and Greer, the driver, he's sticking to Kennedy's body like glue. They're into the Bethesda morgue, and that's when he's telling his sob story to Cyber O'Neill, trying to say that the president sometimes ordered us to slow down. He's trying to paint that night the victim is to blame type of mythology starting its rear its ugly head. But to their credit, that's why nothing's black and white in this case. Kellerman and Greer gave testimony to the Warren Commission and in interviews to the House Select Committee go against official history. Neither one of them believed the single bullet theory. They said the shot in the back did not pass through. There was no lane for an exit of this bullet in the back. Okay, and they're talking about the right rear of the head for their descriptions. In fact, Roy Kellerman famously drew a image that came out in the 90s, thanks to the ARB, showing the back of the head of Kennedy being gone. And Roy Kellerman died in 1984. I spoke to his widow. His wife's name is June Kellerman. And I asked her about what her husband thought of President Kennedy, about the assassination. She says, oh, he always accepted that there was a conspiracy. Anthony Summers, who wrote a 1994 Vanity Fair article, was very curious about that. He also spoke to June Kellerman, told him the same thing. So Roy Kellerman, again, in one respect, his actions and actions lead to suspicions, but he also is kind of like a hero because he said to the Warren Commission, there had to have been more than 3 shots, gentlemen. If you see the films and photos, they'll tell you a different story. And again, his description of the wounds and his actions at Bethesda, it's just like a real, but I think what it is things are compartmentalized, and sometimes people don't realize the ramifications of what they're saying. Because at the time, the Oswald myth wasn't etched in stone yet. You know, he's still alive. He's not killed by Ruby yet. They're not realizing that, wait a minute, how could he be from behind? Like even the newsmen, I have the videos on my YouTube channel of the newsmen, they just couldn't understand the incongruity of, wait a minute, this gentleman's from behind, yet the doctor's saying he was shot from the front. Like Frank McGee tells millions of people, President Kennedy, as we know, was shot from the rear, and incongruously, somehow or another, he was shot from the front. But again, like my parents said, I told you before, they said, Vin, 10 people could have killed Kennedy. We were so bereaved. All these details you're laying on us decades later went in one ear, not the other. And that was the key to the cover-up. So you can say to yourself, Vince, it's so patently obvious there was a conspiracy. How did they get away with it? They got away with it because before Woodward Bernstein, investigative journalism, before the internet, before people, the word of God was basically the word of the press back in the 60s. So when they're telling us that Oswald had to alone, it's time to move on, people. A lot of people did until Mark Lane and other people started to question. So, yeah.
Okay. Can I just pause there? Are there any other questions from the floor at this point? Mike Dworetzky.
Here. The story of finding the bullet in the limousine. What's the name of the agent again?
Paul Landis?
Paul Landis. No, was he the one who just recently wrote the book?
Yeah, yes.
Yes, that's the one.
I mean, that, as you said, the chain of possession is completely broken, but it's absolutely crazy. I mean, I know I believe him, but what the hell? And
Exactly. Good reaction. That's it.
the other point was that when that bullet was presented to, I can't remember whether it was a Secret Service agent or a policeman or what, or it got to the lab, they said, well, was there any blood on it? And he said, no, it was completely clean.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. That's, again, not just the bullet's trajectory, but the condition of the bullet. And then how many people are laying claim to finding a bullet or bullets? And Paul Landis, he had this massive best-selling book. It's good news in one respect. It shows the interest in Kennedy assassination is alive and well. But the disturbing thing about Paul Landis, it really makes me mad about him, he doesn't mention one time in his best-selling book that he wrote 2 reports after the assassination stating a shot came from the front. During the Warren Commission volumes, volume 18, matter of fact, there's 2 reports from Paul Landis within days of assassination written saying he believed the shot came from the overpass. Now I'm paraphrasing this part, grassy knoll area, but the front. He says the front. He doesn't mention that in all of his books. So 99.9% of his readers aren't going to know that. That's very dishonest. That's what I mean. You got to weigh and consider things. On one hand, I have some gratitude he came out with this book. It's very grist for the mill. There's something wrong with single bullet theory. And he's finding another bullet. It's supposedly the bullet. But on the other hand, the sins of omission are just amazing to me. And it just how he wouldn't tell his audience that he wrote 2 reports. And then another thing, too, is when the House Select Committee contacted him in 1979 when they were writing the final report, it's buried in a footnote in the final report. It says Paul Landis, outside contact report. Paul Landis confirms the veracity of his reports given to the Warren Commission. So he couldn't later lay claim that, oh, I was mistaken about the shot from the front. Up to 1979, 16 years later, he's saying my reports stand, basically. But yet he can't tell his readers in a book. That's a pretty big omission to not have that in a book. That's why there's so much conflict with the Secret Service, my pet area. We didn't get a chance to get into it just in 30 seconds or whatever. I'll just tell you that Gerald Blaine and Clint Hill, this is going to sound like delusions of grandeur, but it's not. Trust me. They literally came out with their first book, not the subsequent book, but the first book because of me. They saw my writings online. They were very disturbed. They wanted to put a squelch to the notion that Kennedy had anything to do with the assassination, but their books show the total opposite. They claim over and over and over again that President Kennedy ordered him off the car, and that's why the assassination was a success. Yet Gerald Blaine, to me, years before his book came out, was one of the many agents who told me President Kennedy never ordered us off the car. He never interfered with our actions, but they realized how bad that's going to look when they were surfing the internet, seeing what I had to write. It's a real long story. There's an article on Kennedy's and King about it, but yeah, so I could lay claim to me the blame for them coming out with their books, not the subsequent books, but the initial book by both of them. So
Just going back to the Paul Landis bullet finding revelation. Sam Kinney told his neighbour, didn't he, that he found an intact bullet in the limousine, and you obviously interviewed him as well. I mean, how many bullets were found by agents in the car?
Yeah, that's what I mean. This is why this is so crazy. Now, here, to be fair to Sam was interviewed by the High Select Committee, didn't mention anything about a bullet. When I spoke to him 3 times at length, twice on audio tape back in the early 90s, in fact, I think one or both are on my YouTube channel, he mentions nothing about a bullet, but he does believe there's a conspiracy and says other things against official history, like the back of the head being gone and this, that, and the other. He never mentioned to me about the bullet, but he sounds very credible, Gary Laux, his neighbor. He doesn't sound like a crackpot. He sounds pretty lucid, pretty matter of fact. It says that Sam told him that he found what became the magic bullet. If you're suspicious, and I know other people are about Paul Landis, some people were wondering, Sam Kinney's dead, and now Gary Laux, the neighbor, just passed away a couple years ago. If you're skeptical, you might think, did Paul Landis borrow this story knowing that Sam and Gary are both conveniently gone and they couldn't sue or come out of the woodwork and say that's not true? Hate to cast aspersions, but when you figure Paul Landis has already omitted the 2 reports saying a shot from the front, and he had a big payday with his book. The book was a massive bestseller, and he was on every major network. I mean, Paul Landis, I mean, he made so much money off this book. It's incredible. I mean, really is. And he had something to sell. And this thing he sold there was this other bullet. So it's either it's made up or it's true. Either way looks bad because it makes you think, well, why is he lying? And it gets back to my research. Why are the agents initially saying that President Kennedy didn't want him off the car to the Warren Commission in these official reports that were only given to the Warren Commission only because they asked 6 months later, 5 agents. Those same agents I interviewed, those same ones in the reports, tell me the exact opposite. When the films and photos come out, I go, my God, there are agents in the back of the car. They claim this happened in Florida. The 28-mile motorcade, they're hanging on the back of the car in the films and photos. And I spoke to Russell Groover. He said all the agents were in the back of the whole time. Congressman Sam Gibbons, he rode right beside Kennedy in that trip to Tampa. So the agents were on the back of the car the entire time. I heard no such order. But what that does is they realize the Secret Service, little old me out in the wilderness, was casting aspersions on them because they realized that this fella is realizing that the ball was on us for dropping the ball in Dallas. And so that's why they had to do what they did with their books later on. So,
okay, I've got another floor question from Johnny Cairns.
Oh, Johnny, how you doing?
Just a quick one. How do you feel about all these agents who effectively failed in their duty that day, making thousands off the death of President Kennedy? Because I mean, Clint Hill's made obviously thousands of dollars, and so is a list of conservative agents general, Paul Landis, etc. But ultimately, they failed that day. The president died. So how do you feel about them obviously making money off their failure and his death?
Johnny, you saying how do I feel about their failure? Or
no, the fact that they've been able to monetize this through multiple books, Landis and Bain and
Blaine. This is no exaggeration. Blaine, Hill, and Landis have made an amazing amount of money. Just to give you an idea, Simon & Schuster for Blaine and Hill, it's the number one company in the world. They got a $250,000 advance each for their first books. Lord knows about the follow-ups. Each book has sold hundreds of thousands of copies, even though the movie was scrapped, thanks to yours truly. That's another story. It's too long to talk about. They had a Hollywood movie that was going to come out in 2013, laying the blame on President Kennedy for ordering them off the car. So all these people in the world would say, hey, Vince, your research is full of it. I saw a movie saying that he ordered them off the car. It wasn't until I got in touch with the director and showed him all my research, the movie was scrapped because of me. But the bottom line is they have made a ton of money. I mean, it makes me mad. They always say conspiracy theorists are in this for the money. I work for a living. I'm not rich. I live in an apartment. Okay. These guys are making tons of money.
Just in the interest of time, Vince, because we've got a couple of other areas to cover. David, you've got a question?
Yeah, it may be a slightly hypothetical, but just in terms of the pattern of evidence, if the assassination hadn't taken place as it was and Kennedy had gone on to make his speech that afternoon, are there any other indications of what was going on with the Secret Service that would, go to that pattern, that there was suspicious activity with the Secret Service into the trademark?
Yes, I would just say in a general way, it came out in the late 1990s that 4 agents spoke to ABC TV and Seymour Hersh. You can take Seymour Hersh out of it. I know people aren't big fans of his work, but just they talked to ABC, and one of them was the agent on the follow-up car, Tim McIntyre, about their anger and disgust at President Kennedy's private life. So you have those kind of feelings, like a cultural feeling within some parts of the Secret Service. Then you have the terrible security, lack thereof, in Dallas, President Kennedy's killed. You have these kind of ill feelings about President Kennedy's foreign policy. Again, not all the agents, but some. All it takes a few bad actors. And what happened. And we're supposed to believe that on that day, coincidentally, Oswald, a lone man, like Lifton used to say, a man in a building shot a man in a car. What a coincidence. His security stripped. And it took many years for the stuff to come out. So what I think is, unfortunately, the Secret Service, well, I know this part, they knew of many multiple threats to President Kennedy. In fact, my new book coming out next month is The Plot to Kill President Kennedy in Chicago. And I have corroboration of a plot to kill President Kennedy in Chicago. It doesn't all live and breathe on Abraham Bolden. There's much more to it than that. But there were other threats in the year 63 alone to President Kennedy. This was a moving crime. If they wouldn't have got him in Dallas, sadly, they probably would have got him elsewhere is the answer. But if he would have had better security, I think he stood a fighting chance of surviving, as he did before Dallas. And again, if these security measures would have been invoked in Kennedy kills, then I don't even think of the Secret Service. It's just the level. Then you mix in with their feelings and you put the two together, and it's cause for suspicion, so.
Okay, Vince, can just want to move on because we've got about 5 minutes left, I think.
Sure.
Can we, again, post-assassination activities, could you just give us your insight into the Secret Service destroying those records in the 1990s, and which records did they destroy? How relevant were they?
Extremely relevant. This is the thing. The Assassination Records Review Board themselves, Judge John Thunheim, the head of the ARB, and other people below him, wanted to have congressional investigations against the Secret Service. They said not even the CIA, the military, or the FBI did what the Secret Service did. The Secret Service was told, do not destroy any records until we look at them. In January 1995, guess what the Secret Service did? They destroyed records of President Kennedy's trips in the fall of 63. Boy, that's pretty germane to me, because the few Secret Service that survived the shredder, there's few records that survived the shredder, show building rooftops being guarded in Tampa. Yeah, it says multi-story building rooftops would be guarded by the sheriff's department on this movement, 28 miles long. Dallas was only 10 miles long in comparison. They destroyed motorcade records, Secret Service official motorcade records from September through about mid-November. And in my latest book, thanks to William Kelly, researcher William Kelly as well, helped me with this, shows the specific records, these specific ones, the trips, the dates they destroyed. And only because I paid a fee to newspaperarchives.com and the films and photos have been released 5 to 15 years to compare what has survived, I said, no wonder they destroyed those records in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Building rooftops are guarded. He had the bubble top. He had agents by the car, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's only little old me that was doing this stuff out in the wilderness. I guess I work for a living. No great claim to fame here. It is what it is. I was curious about this, but bottom line, get back in the story here. The ARB was livid, and they came very close to having congressional hearings. Interestingly enough, one of the Secret Service officials involved in the destruction was Ralph Basham. He later became director of the Secret Service. So if people want to think, oh, Vince, get a life, not none of you fine people, but people out there in the world might say, Vince, this is 60 years later. Come on, it's time to move on. When you realize it's old men out there, Clint Hill, Gerald Blaine, and Paul Lannis writing best-selling massive books, making money, peddling lies. When you have the Secret Service of the modern era, late 90s, destroying records, you realize there's something to this. Because if Oswald acted alone, there's nothing to this. They would have gladly handed all these records. See, Vince, see? He didn't have this protection you're claiming he did. Look. And they realize, if those records would have came out based on the surviving newspaper archives of films and photos and testimony, we would see, my God, look at the protection President Kennedy normally got. Why didn't he have this protection? Maybe there would have been modern day ARB hearings and said, why weren't agents doing what they did on these prior trips in September and October and November? But they were conveniently shredded, and they were shredded after. So you can't even claim it was an accident. I don't think anybody would believe it was an accident, but they were told not to, and they still did. It's heinous, it's illegal, it's immoral. And again, like a lot of things, because it's Secret Service related, a lot of people didn't get too much of a huff about it until myself and Doug Horn pointed out. Then they go, my God, I didn't realize this. Even the boogeyman, the CIA, didn't destroy records like the Secret Service did. So, yeah.
All right. Well, look, very briefly, give us just a couple of minutes or so. Have you looked into the Trump assassination attempt from the Secret Service perspective?
Yes, I have, and it's very alarming. Just very briefly, how that adjoining rooftop was not guarded is crazy, because post-assassination of JFK and all through the decades, the attempts, the threats, countless ones, they had a counter-assault team, which they did on the adjoining rooftop. And we're supposed to believe some young kid right out of high school got on a rooftop of an AR-15 and came within millimeters, allegedly, of killing Trump on a joint rooftop. And the crowd is yelling, there's someone on the rooftop, there's someone. There's an AR-15 of all things. It's a tremendous breach of security. It's very alarming. And again, I would just tell you personally, I'm not a fan of President Trump, but I don't wish him any ill, or anybody else any ill for that matter. You don't want that. You don't need that. It's the bottom line. But the thing is, the Secret Service dropped the ball tremendously. The only thing in their favor is President Trump lived. So there's not the ire that you would normally see. It kind of, I hate to say it, after like a week or so, kind of went away because he lived. If he would have been killed, I would say that would be the end of the Secret Service. Some other function or organization would have taken control. But just the rooftops themselves. They left Trump as a stationary target after he was shot. They left him stand to go like this and fight. They should have had him on the ground immediately, not to get up there and have a photo op. They didn't pass. They passed people through magnetometers, but this Thomas Crooks, the shooter, they saw him with these hunting binoculars and no gun at the time. That should have been a red flag. What's he having hunting glasses for? And bottom line is, citizens, regular people noticed him, were shouting. And for a minute, there's a video on, of all places, TikTok. You can hear people going, there's someone on the rooftop. There's someone on the rooftop. In real time, President Trump is speaking. It's crazy.
Vince,
Yeah.
on that point you said about the Secret Service losing responsibility for protection. Is it true that prior to the Kennedy assassination, the Kennedys wanted the presidential protection to be taken away from the Secret Service? Is that true?
No, not to that. No. There was a feeling in the wind after the assassination that J. Edgar Hoover would give his hide teeth to have. Now, President Truman famously wrote a letter. It might even be in the book by David McCullough, but it's definitely verified. Harry Truman said the Secret Service would give their eyeballs to take over for the Secret Service. J. Edgar Hoover wanted. He was jealous of this, competitive federal agency. And he saw an opening when the assassination began. Briefly, there was a feeling in the wind of, these 9 agents drank the night before we lost the president. wow, what happened. But see, they were able to successfully sweep it under the carpet, believe it or not. Johnson took over. We had to worry about the Vietnam War. It was taken as, oh, was this man in a building, this lunatic? Okay, things happen. We'll make sure it doesn't happen again. And that's how they were able to get away with it. But yeah, there was a feeling in the wind for a little while after the assassination, not before, although Truman famously wrote this letter. I think it was to his wife talking about the Hoover would love to take the Secret Service over. So,
Okay.
yeah.
I've got one final question from Johnny Cairns.
Just go back to the Trump assassination there, Vince. Do you feel like the guy or the nutcase that took a shot at Trump, do you feel he would have had more success if he went for a man like Carcano instead?
Oh, that was good.
That was
No, actually, no. Trump could have stood there and continued on his speech, Johnny. You've been okay.
So we've got a couple of minutes then, as that was a facetious question. Your three bad actors are Greer, Boring, and Roberts. Have you subsequent to when you came to the conclusion it was those three, felt that there were other bad actors that are emerging as you've continued your research over the decades?
Two more, yeah. In addition to those three, I have big suspicion on Elmer Moore. I mentioned him earlier. Elmer Moore badgered the Parkland doctors and also Texas School Book Depository people like Givens and others to change their stories and augment their stories. And he famously came out and said President Kennedy was a traitor. And after the assassination, Forrest Sorrells, the head of the Dallas office, board that were FBI generated, some woman kept on coming into the FBI office saying that Forrest Sorrells should be removed from his position because he was anti-Kennedy, anti-government. He gave speeches against Kennedy, and Forrest Sorrells should be investigated. It turns out that Forrest Sorrells poo-pooed any use of the FBI, and a couple of days before the assassination, Forrest Sorrells was involved in the motorcade route security or lack thereof. You know, when Congressly Forrest Sorrells intimated a shot came from the front, that's why nothing's black and white here. But those two, in addition to Bill Greer, the driver of the limousine, Emory Roberts, and Floyd Boring, the planner of the Texas trip of the Secret Service point of view, Elmer Moore and Forrest Sorrells would join them as far as being, you know, it's all it takes is people to give orders in positions of authority, and all the other agents are just following those orders, no matter how perplexing they are, they're following it. So there you go. It's not the whole agency, it's just a few.
All right, well, there's one more question from the floor. It's just arisen. Robert Mance.
Just on that point of badgering witnesses, I believe that Jean Hill gave a statement about how she heard 4 or 5 or more shots, and the person she was giving that statement to talked her down. I mean, kept saying, "Sorry, it's only 3." And I thought that was a Secret Service agent. Who was taking her interview. Do you know that one?
Yeah, it turns out that I think that was actually a newspaper reporter. I mean, I love Jean Hill. Her book's good. And the bottom line about Jean Hill, very briefly, is the good news is she's corroborated that day. There's network black and white video, phone hookups and interviews. She's saying she heard 4 to 6 shots. She thought they came across the street. She's on solid ground about the shots originating from the grassy knoll. That's the good news. The bad news is, I hate to say it, but her book from the early 90s, I think she took some liberties, make it a little more dramatic and whatnot. And I think it was Featherstone, his name, from the Dallas Morning News, interviewed her. It wasn't a Secret Service agent, but in her story it became a Secret Service agent. So that's one bit. I frankly don't believe that. I think it was a reporter. Yeah. It was dramatized in the JFK movie though. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Okay, Vince. All right. Well, look, Vince, the next speaker's arriving in 3 minutes, so we ought to try and wrap this up. Thank you very much. I'm very appreciative that you gave an hour and a half of your time here today.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you. Thanks to your audience. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Okay, good.